The autumn wind swept through Silver Ridge, Nevada, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the sound of whispered judgments. Catherine Morrison pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked down Main Street, her 3 children trailing behind her like ducklings following their mother. "There goes the widow woman again," Mayor Whitman muttered to his companion outside the bank. "3 mouths to feed and no husband to provide. It's a shame, really." Kate pretended not to hear, just as she pretended not to notice the way conversations stopped when she passed, the way eyes followed her with a mixture of pity and disdain. She'd grown used to it in the 2 years since cholera had taken her husband, James, leaving her alone with Tommy, Lucy, and baby Samuel. "Mama," 8-year-old Lucy whispered, tugging at Kate's faded blue dress. "Why is Mrs. Hartwell staring at us like that?" Kate glanced toward the general store where Agnes Hartwell stood with 2 other women, their heads bent together in conversation. The moment they saw Kate looking, they scattered like startled chickens. "Never mind them, sweetheart," Kate said softly, smoothing Lucy's golden hair. "We have shopping to do." Inside Henderson's general store, the familiar ritual began. Kate counted her meager coins carefully, calculating what they could afford versus what they needed. Tommy, at 12, was old enough to understand their situation and stood quietly beside her, his young face already bearing the serious expression of someone forced to grow up too quickly. "Mrs. Morrison," Mr. Henderson said politely but coolly, "I'm afraid your account is getting rather substantial." Kate's cheeks burned with embarrassment. The store credit James had established was long overdue, but Henderson had been patient, more patient than she had any right to expect. "I understand, Mr. Henderson. I'm expecting payment for some sewing work next week." "Perhaps." "Sewing work." The voice belonged to Mrs. Hartwell, who had apparently followed them into the store. "My dear woman, surely you can't expect to support 3 children on needlework." The other customers in the store had gone quiet, pretending to examine merchandise while listening to every word. "I manage quite well, thank you," Kate replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "Do you?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried false concern. "Because frankly, dear, it's becoming quite the burden on our community. 3 children without a proper father figure, barely scraping by. Perhaps it's time to consider other arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Kate's voice was steady, but Tommy stepped closer to her side, his fists clenched. "The Territorial Orphanage in Carson City is quite well regarded. The children would receive proper education, regular meals." "My children are not going to any orphanage." Kate's voice cut through the store like a blade. "They have a mother who loves them, and that's all they need." Mrs. Hartwell's lips pursed in disapproval. "Love doesn't put food on the table, Catherine. Sometimes we must make difficult choices for the greater good." Before Kate could respond, the store's bell chimed, and a new presence filled the doorway. Sheriff Daniel Mackenzie stepped inside, his tall frame casting a shadow across the floor. At 6 feet 4 inches, with broad shoulders and steel-gray eyes, he commanded attention without saying a word. The store fell completely silent. "Afternoon, folks," the sheriff said in his low, gravelly voice. His gaze swept the room, taking in the tense scene, before settling on Kate with surprising gentleness. "Sheriff Mackenzie," Mrs. Hartwell simpered, suddenly all smiles. "How lovely to see you. We were just discussing." "Ma'am." The sheriff touched the brim of his hat politely but didn't encourage further conversation. Instead, he walked directly to where Kate stood with her children. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "I believe you left this at the church yesterday." He held out a small cloth purse, not hers, Kate realized immediately, but she understood the gesture. The sheriff was giving her a way to pay for her purchases without further humiliation. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said softly, accepting the purse. "I was wondering where I'd left it." The sheriff nodded once, then turned his attention to the children. "Tommy, I hear you've been helping old Pete at the livery stable." "Yes, sir," Tommy replied, straightening with pride. "Good man. Hard work builds character." The sheriff's hand briefly touched the boy's shoulder, and Kate saw something she'd never seen before, her son beaming with pride at a man's approval. As the sheriff prepared to leave, Mrs. Hartwell couldn't resist one final comment. "Sheriff, surely a man in your position understands the importance of proper social order. When certain situations become burdensome to the community." Sheriff Mackenzie turned slowly to face Mrs. Hartwell, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Mrs. Hartwell, I find that the most burdensome people in any community are usually those who spend their time judging others instead of helping them." With that, he touched his hat brim once more and walked out, leaving Mrs. Hartwell speechless and Kate staring after him with something she hadn't felt in 2 years: hope. That evening, as Kate tucked her children into their beds in the small cabin behind the church, Tommy surprised her with a question that caught her off guard. "Mama, do you think Sheriff Mackenzie likes us?" Kate paused in her tucking of Samuel's blanket. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "The way he looked at you today. And he knows my name, even though I've barely talked to him." Tommy's young face was serious in the lamplight. "He stood up for us, didn't he?" "The sheriff is a good man who believes in treating people fairly," Kate said carefully. "Mrs. Hartwell sure didn't like what he said to her." Lucy giggled from her small bed. "Did you see her face, Mama? She looked like she'd swallowed a pickle." Despite everything, Kate smiled. "Lucy Morrison, that's not kind." "But it's true," Lucy protested. "And I don't care if it's not kind. She's mean to us all the time." From his crib, 3-year-old Samuel had already fallen asleep, his thumb in his mouth and his dark hair curling against the pillow. He looked so much like his father that sometimes Kate's heart ached just looking at him. "Children," Kate said gently, "I want you to understand something. People like Mrs. Hartwell, they're not necessarily bad people. They're just afraid." "Afraid of what?" Tommy asked. "Afraid of anything that's different from what they know. A woman raising children alone isn't what they're used to, so they think it must be wrong." Kate sat down on the edge of Tommy's bed. "But that doesn't mean we have to let their fear control our lives." "Is that why you won't marry Mr. Peterson?" Lucy asked innocently. "Because you don't want to let fear control your life?" Kate's stomach clenched. Harold Peterson, the bank clerk, had indeed been making increasingly obvious overtures toward her, but not out of affection. She knew he saw her children as a burden to be endured in exchange for other considerations she refused to think about. "I won't marry anyone unless I love them and unless they love all of us," Kate said firmly. "You children are not a burden to be endured. You're a blessing to be treasured." "What about Sheriff Mackenzie?" Tommy asked quietly. "Would you marry him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamp. Kate felt her cheeks warm, grateful for the dim lighting. "Tommy, the sheriff is a good man, but he's never shown any interest in that sort of thing. Besides, a man in his position wouldn't want the complications of a ready-made family." But even as she said the words, Kate remembered the gentle way the sheriff had looked at her children, the protective stance he'd taken in the store, the kindness in his eyes when he'd handed her the purse. A soft knock at the cabin door interrupted her thoughts. Kate frowned. Who would be calling at this hour? "Stay in bed," she whispered to the children, then walked to the door. "Who is it?" "Sheriff Mackenzie, ma'am. Sorry to disturb you so late." Kate's heart began beating faster as she opened the door. The sheriff stood on her small porch, hat in hand, looking almost nervous. "Sheriff, is everything all right?" "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to make sure you and the children got home safely after what happened at the store today." It was a kind gesture, but Kate sensed there was more to his visit. "We're fine, thank you. Would you like to come in for coffee?" "I don't want to impose." "It's no imposition. Please." As the sheriff entered the small cabin, Kate was acutely aware of how humble her home must seem to him. The furniture was simple, some of it handmade by James. The children's toys were few and well worn. But it was clean and warm, and she was proud of what she'd managed to create for her family. "Mama." Tommy's voice came from the bedroom. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Go to sleep." The sheriff smiled slightly at the exchange. "He's protective of you." "He's had to grow up too quickly," Kate said, putting water on for coffee. "Sometimes I think he believes he's the man of the house now." "He's not wrong. But that's a heavy burden for a 12-year-old boy." Kate studied the sheriff's face in the lamplight. There was something in his expression, understanding, perhaps even recognition. "You sound as if you speak from experience," she said softly. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "My father died when I was 13. Left my mother with 4 children and a farm that was barely profitable. I became the man of the house overnight." "I'm sorry. That must have been very difficult." "It was. But it also taught me something important, that a family's worth isn't measured by its conventional structure, but by the love and determination that holds it together." Kate felt tears prick at her eyes. When was the last time someone had understood what she was trying to do for her children? "Mrs. Morrison," the sheriff continued, his voice gentle, "I want you to know that what Mrs. Hartwell said today, there are others in town who don't share her opinion." "Are there?" Kate couldn't keep the skepticism out of her voice. "Yes. And if anyone gives you or your children trouble again, I want you to come to me immediately." Kate looked into his steel-gray eyes and saw something that made her breath catch, not just kindness, but something deeper. Something that looked remarkably like caring. "Why?" she whispered. The sheriff held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because every child deserves to grow up feeling safe and valued. And every parent deserves support, not judgment." As he prepared to leave, the sheriff paused at the door. "Mrs. Morrison? The purse I gave you today, keep it. Consider it a donation from someone who believes in what you're doing here." After he left, Kate sat alone in her small kitchen, holding the cloth purse and trying to understand what had just happened. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. Outside, unbeknownst to Kate, Sheriff Mackenzie stood in the shadows for several more minutes, watching her cabin and thinking about the conversation he'd just had. He'd been drawn to Catherine Morrison for months. Not just by her beauty, which was considerable, but by her quiet strength and unwavering devotion to her children. What he hadn't told her was that he'd been deliberately watching over her family for weeks, making sure they were safe, intervening quietly when necessary. The confrontation at the store today had simply been the first time he'd done it publicly. As he finally walked back toward town, Sheriff Mackenzie made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop watching from the shadows. The Silver Dollar Saloon buzzed with conversation the next afternoon as the usual crowd of miners, ranch hands, and townspeople gathered for their daily dose of whiskey and gossip. Bill Crawford wiped down glasses behind the bar while keeping one ear tuned to the various conversations flowing around his establishment. "Did you see the way Mackenzie looked at that Hartwell woman yesterday?" chuckled Pete from the livery stable. "Thought she was gonna faint right there in Henderson's store." "About time someone put Agnes in her place," grumbled old Tom Brennan, a retired miner with more opinions than teeth. "Woman's got a tongue sharper than a Bowie knife and twice as dangerous." Mayor Whitman, nursing his usual afternoon whiskey, looked up from his drink with interest. "What exactly happened? I heard there was some sort of scene." "Scene's putting it mildly," Pete replied. "Agnes was going on about how the Morrison widow should give up her children to some orphanage, making quite a spectacle of herself. Then the sheriff walks in, cool as you please, and basically tells her to mind her own business." "He defended the widow?" Whitman's eyebrows rose. "That's interesting." Bill Crawford set down the glass he'd been cleaning and leaned against the bar. "Seems to me Mackenzie's been taking an unusual interest in that family lately. Seen him walking past their cabin more often than his usual patrol route would require." "Are you suggesting our sheriff has romantic inclinations toward Mrs. Morrison?" The voice belonged to Harold Peterson, the bank clerk, who had just entered the saloon. His tone suggested he found the idea personally offensive. Wouldn't blame him if he did, Tom Brennan said with a shrug. She's a fine-looking woman, and from what I hear, she's got more backbone than half the men in this town. Peterson's face reddened. The woman has 3 children, Brennan. 3 children and no visible means of supporting them. Any man would be taking on a considerable burden. Burden. Pete's voice carried a warning edge. Those are children you're talking about, Peterson. And good children, from what I've seen. The boy helps me at the stable sometimes, works harder than most grown men. That's admirable, but it doesn't change the practical realities, Peterson insisted. A man in the sheriff's position needs to think about his reputation, his future. Taking on another man's children, especially when there are so many of them. 3 children ain't exactly a biblical plague, Peterson, Crawford interrupted. Besides, seems to me a man's character is judged more by how he treats those who need help than by how he avoids responsibility. Mayor Whitman was listening to this exchange with growing interest. As the town's political leader, he was always concerned about anything that might affect the community's stability, or his own position. Gentlemen, he said carefully, while I'm sure Sheriff Mackenzie's personal life is his own business, we must consider the broader implications. If our law enforcement officer were to complicate his situation with domestic responsibilities, it might affect his effectiveness. How do you figure? Pete asked bluntly. Well, a man with a large family has more to lose, more to worry about. It might make him cautious when boldness is required, or distracted when focus is essential. Old Tom Brennan snorted derisively. That's the biggest load of bull I've heard all week, Whitman. A man with a family to protect is twice as motivated to keep the peace, not less. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Hartwell herself, accompanied by 2 other prominent ladies of the town, Mrs. Crawford, Bill's wife, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store. The women looked like they were on a mission. Gentlemen, Mrs. Hartwell said with icy politeness, I hope you'll excuse our interruption, but there's a matter of community concern we need to discuss. Bill Crawford looked at his wife with surprise. Margaret, what are you doing here? We've been talking, Bill, and we're concerned about the influence certain situations might be having on our town's moral fabric. What situations? Pete asked, though his tone suggested he already knew where this was heading. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. The Morrison situation. It's becoming quite unseemly. A woman alone with children, struggling to make ends meet, now apparently attracting the attention of our sheriff. What's unseemly about it? Tom Brennan demanded. It sets a poor example, Mrs. Hartwell said primly. Young women might get the idea that they can manage without proper husbands, that society will simply accommodate their unconventional choices. Unconventional choices? Pete's voice was rising. Lady, Catherine Morrison didn't choose to become a widow. Her husband died of cholera, same as 20 other folks in this town 2 years ago. That's true, Mrs. Hartwell conceded, but her choices since then have been questionable. Refusing perfectly suitable marriage proposals, insisting on maintaining her independence when she clearly can't manage it. She's refused marriage proposals? Bill Crawford looked genuinely surprised. Harold Peterson has made his intentions quite clear, Mrs. Henderson said, glancing at the bank clerk. He's offered to provide for her and the children, give them stability and respectability. Yet she continues to refuse him. All eyes turned to Peterson, who looked deeply uncomfortable. The offer stands, he said stiffly. Though I must say, if she's encouraging the sheriff's attentions while rejecting more practical arrangements. Wait just a minute, Pete interrupted. Are you suggesting that Catherine Morrison is somehow improper because she won't marry you but might welcome the sheriff's interest? I'm suggesting that a woman in her position should be more concerned with practical considerations than romantic fantasies, Peterson replied coldly. The saloon fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then old Tom Brennan started laughing, a dry, raspy sound that made everyone turn to look at him. Peterson, he wheezed, I've seen a lot of things in my 73 years, but I ain't never seen a man get so worked up about a woman choosing someone else over him. Maybe the problem ain't that she's being impractical. Maybe the problem is that she's got better sense than you gave her credit for." Before Peterson could respond, the saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Mackenzie himself walked in. The conversation died instantly, leaving an awkward silence that seemed to stretch on forever. "Afternoon, folks," the sheriff said calmly, his eyes taking in the assembled crowd and clearly sensing the tension. "Everything all right here?" "Of course, Sheriff," Mrs. Hartwell said quickly. "We were just having a community discussion." "About what?" The silence stretched on until Pete from the livery stable spoke up. "About the Morrison family, actually. Some folks seem to think they're a problem that needs solving." Sheriff Mackenzie's gray eyes grew cold. "Is that so? And what kind of solving did they have in mind?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and suddenly everyone in the saloon realized they were standing at a crossroads. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Catherine Morrison and her children, but the future of their entire community. Sheriff Mackenzie's presence seemed to fill the saloon as he waited for someone to answer his question. The silence stretched on until Mrs. Hartwell, never one to back down from what she considered her civic duty, stepped forward. "Sheriff, we're simply concerned about the welfare of the Morrison children. 3 young ones with only their mother to provide for them. It's not an ideal situation." "And what would you consider ideal, Mrs. Hartwell?" The sheriff's voice was deceptively calm, but everyone in the saloon could sense the steel beneath it. Pete from the livery stable exchanged glances with old Tom Brennan, both men recognizing the warning signs. "Well, naturally, the children need proper supervision, adequate nutrition, educational opportunities." Mrs. Hartwell's voice grew more confident as she outlined what she clearly considered reasonable concerns. "And you believe Mrs. Morrison isn't providing these things?" "I'm sure she's doing her best, but a woman alone, with limited resources, has adequate supervision," the sheriff interrupted. "Tommy helps Pete at the livery stable and has learned more about honest work in the past month than most boys learn in a year. Lucy helps her mother with household tasks and can read better than half the adults in this town. And Samuel is healthy, happy, and loved." "But the financial situation," Mrs. Henderson began. "Is none of your business," Sheriff Mackenzie said flatly. "Mrs. Morrison pays her debts, contributes to the community, and raises her children to be productive citizens. What more do you want from her?" Harold Peterson finally found his voice. "Sheriff, with all due respect, perhaps you're too close to the situation to see it objectively." The temperature in the saloon seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sheriff Mackenzie turned his full attention to Peterson, and the bank clerk visibly paled. "Mr. Peterson, are you suggesting that my professional judgment is compromised?" No, of course not. I simply meant that perhaps someone less involved might see solutions that aren't apparent to those who are emotionally invested." "Emotionally invested." The sheriff repeated the words as if testing their taste. "You know what, Peterson? You're absolutely right. I am emotionally invested in making sure that good people aren't harassed by busybodies and fortune hunters." Peterson's face flushed red. "Fortune hunters? I'll have you know that my offer to Mrs. Morrison was made out of Christian charity." "Charity?" Old Tom Brennan's laugh was like sandpaper on wood. "Peterson, the only charity you've ever shown was giving yourself change for $1. "That's enough," Mayor Whitman interjected, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Sheriff, surely you can understand the community's concern. We all want what's best for the Morrison family." "Do you?" Sheriff Mackenzie's gaze swept the room. "Because from where I stand, it looks like a bunch of people who have nothing better to do than tear down a woman who's doing everything right." "Everything right?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice rose indignantly. "Sheriff, the woman is living in poverty with 3 children. How is that everything right?" "She's living with dignity, Mrs. Hartwell. There's a difference." Bill Crawford, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Sheriff, what are you saying exactly? That the town should just leave the Morrison family alone?" "I'm saying that Catherine Morrison is one of the finest people in this town, and her children are a credit to her character. And I'm saying that anyone who has a problem with that situation will have to take it up with me personally." The saloon fell completely silent. Everyone understood what the sheriff was really saying. He was putting the Morrison family under his official protection. It was an unprecedented move that would change the entire dynamic of the town. Mayor Whitman cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, that's a very definitive position to take." "Yes, it is." Sheriff Mackenzie's voice carried absolute certainty. "And there's something else you all should know." He paused, and in that moment, everyone in the saloon held their breath. "I've asked Mrs. Morrison to marry me." The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the clock behind the bar sounded like thunder. Mrs. Hartwell's mouth fell open. Peterson looked like he'd been slapped. Even old Tom Brennan stared in amazement. "Asked her to?" Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Marry me," the sheriff repeated clearly. "Yesterday evening, after the incident at the store. I told her I'd been watching her for months, admiring her courage and her devotion to her children. I told her that I'd be honored to call myself their stepfather and her husband." "And?" Bill Crawford asked, his voice barely audible. Sheriff Mackenzie's stern expression softened slightly, and for just a moment, he looked like any man in love rather than the intimidating lawman they all knew. "She said yes." The explosion of noise that followed was immediate and chaotic. Mrs. Hartwell began sputtering indignantly, Peterson's face turned purple with rage, and several of the men began talking at once. But it was Mayor Whitman who managed to make himself heard above the din. "Sheriff, this is highly irregular. You can't just announce an engagement like this, without any proper courtship, without consulting the community leaders." "Whitman," Sheriff Mackenzie said quietly, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I don't need your permission to marry the woman I love. And I sure as hell don't need the community's approval to protect my family." "Your family." Peterson's voice cracked on the words. "My family," the sheriff confirmed. "Catherine, Tommy, Lucy, and Samuel. As of yesterday evening, they're under my protection. All of them. Permanently." He looked around the saloon one more time, his gray eyes hard as flint. "Now, I suggest you all find something more productive to do with your time than gossiping about good people. Because the next person who says one word against my fiancée or her children will be spending the night in jail." With that, Sheriff Mackenzie turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces and racing hearts. Outside, as he walked back toward the jail, Sheriff Mackenzie allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't entirely true, he hadn't actually proposed to Catherine Morrison yet. But he fully intended to, and very soon. The only question now was whether she would really say yes when he asked. That evening, Kate Morrison sat on her small porch, mending one of Tommy's shirts by lamplight while her children played quietly in the yard. The autumn air was crisp, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It had been a peaceful day, no confrontations, no whispered comments, no pitying looks. For once, she felt almost normal. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up from her sewing. Sheriff Mackenzie was walking up the path to her cabin, and something in his bearing, a tension she hadn't seen before, made her set aside her needlework. "Sheriff," she said softly. "Good evening. Mrs. Morrison." He removed his hat and held it in his hands, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "I hope I'm not disturbing your evening." "Not at all. Children, come say hello to Sheriff Mackenzie." Tommy, Lucy, and little Samuel came running from their play, and Kate watched with growing warmth as the sheriff greeted each child individually. He asked Tommy about his work at the livery stable, admired the flower crown Lucy had woven from dried grass, and listened seriously as 3-year-old Samuel told him an elaborate story about chasing a butterfly. "Sheriff Mackenzie," Lucy said with the directness that only children possess, "are you going to marry our mama?" Kate felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Lucy. What a question to ask. But Sheriff Mackenzie didn't seem embarrassed. Instead, he knelt down to Lucy's eye level, his expression serious. Why do you ask, Miss Lucy? Because Mrs. Hartwell told Mrs. Crawford that you were sweet on Mama, and Mrs. Crawford told Mama Henderson, and I heard Mrs. Henderson telling someone at the store that maybe you'd ask Mama to marry you. Lucy paused for breath. And I think you should, because Mama gets sad sometimes when she thinks we're not looking. Lucy Morrison. Kate stood quickly, mortified by her daughter's boldness. It's all right, Sheriff Mackenzie said gently, rising to his feet but keeping his eyes on Lucy. Miss Lucy, what would you think about that? If I did ask your mama to marry me? Lucy considered this with all the seriousness of an 8-year-old making an important decision. Well, I think you're nice. And you're big enough to protect us from mean people. And you know how to talk to Tommy like he's almost grown up, which makes him happy. She paused, then added, and Samuel likes you. He doesn't like Mr. Peterson at all. He hides behind Mama's skirts whenever Mr. Peterson comes around. Kate felt her heart clench at this innocent revelation. She hadn't realized Samuel had been so aware of Peterson's attention. What about you, Tommy? Sheriff Mackenzie asked. What would you think? Tommy, at 12, was old enough to understand the full implications of the question. He looked at his mother, then back at the sheriff, his young face serious. I think, he said slowly, that Mama deserves to be happy. And I think you're the kind of man Papa would have wanted to take care of us if something happened to him. Kate felt tears prick at her eyes. Tommy so rarely mentioned his father, but when he did, it was always with the wisdom of someone who had lost something precious. And you, Master Samuel? Sheriff Mackenzie asked gently. What do you think? 3-year-old Samuel walked directly to the sheriff and raised his arms to be picked up. When Mackenzie obliged, Samuel wrapped his small arms around the big man's neck and whispered loudly, I like you better than the mean man who makes Mama sad. The simple honesty of the child's words seemed to settle something for everyone present. Sheriff Mackenzie held Samuel for a moment longer, then set him gently down. Children, he said seriously, I need to talk to your mama alone for a few minutes. Would you mind going inside and getting ready for bed? Can we listen from the window? Lucy asked hopefully. Lucy! Kate exclaimed, but Sheriff Mackenzie chuckled. You can listen from the window, he agreed. But you have to promise to go straight to bed afterward, no matter what you hear. The children scampered inside, and Kate could immediately see shadows moving behind the thin curtains. She shook her head with amusement and embarrassment. I'm sorry about Lucy's question. She doesn't understand. Actually, Sheriff Mackenzie interrupted, she understands perfectly. Mrs. Morrison. Kate. I need to tell you something. Her heart began beating faster at his use of her first name. What is it? This afternoon, at the Silver Dollar, I may have exaggerated the truth a bit. Kate frowned. I don't understand. Sheriff Mackenzie ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she was learning indicated deep nervousness. The town busybodies were discussing you and the children again, making suggestions about what should be done with your situation. I got angry and told them that I'd asked you to marry me. Kate felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You told them what? I told them we were engaged. He held up a hand as she started to speak. I know I had no right to say that without asking you first, but Kate, I couldn't stand listening to them talk about you and the children like you were some kind of problem to be solved. So you lied to them? Yes. But I want to make it the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Kate's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but beautiful diamond. Catherine Morrison, he said, and his voice was steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I'm asking you now, properly, in front of your children and God and anyone else who cares to know. Will you marry me? Kate stared at the ring, her mind racing. This was happening so fast, but, at the same time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Daniel, she said softly, why? Why do you want to marry me? I come with so much complication. You come with 3 beautiful children who need a father and deserve one who will love them unconditionally. You come with strength and grace and kindness that this town doesn't deserve. And you come with a heart that I've been hoping might have room for one more person. The children scampered inside, and Kate could immediately see shadows moving behind the thin curtains. She shook her head with amusement and embarrassment. I'm sorry about Lucy's question. She doesn't understand. Actually, Sheriff Mackenzie interrupted, she understands perfectly. Mrs. Morrison. Kate. I need to tell you something. Her heart began beating faster at his use of her first name. What is it? This afternoon, at the Silver Dollar, I may have exaggerated the truth a bit. Kate frowned. I don't understand. Sheriff Mackenzie ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she was learning indicated deep nervousness. The town busybodies were discussing you and the children again, making suggestions about what should be done with your situation. I got angry and told them that I'd asked you to marry me. Kate felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You told them what? I told them we were engaged. He held up a hand as she started to speak. I know I had no right to say that without asking you first, but Kate, I couldn't stand listening to them talk about you and the children like you were some kind of problem to be solved. So you lied to them? Yes. But I want to make it the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Kate's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but beautiful diamond. Catherine Morrison, he said, and his voice was steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I'm asking you now, properly, in front of your children and God and anyone else who cares to know. Will you marry me? Kate stared at the ring, her mind racing. This was happening so fast, but, at the same time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Daniel, she said softly, why? Why do you want to marry me? I come with so much complication. You come with 3 beautiful children who need a father and deserve one who will love them unconditionally. You come with strength and grace and kindness that this town doesn't deserve. And you come with a heart that I've been hoping might have room for one more person. The children would really be yours? You wouldn't see them as a burden. Kate, Daniel said, stepping closer, I see them as the greatest blessing I could ask for. Tommy is already the finest young man in this town. Lucy has enough spirit to take on the world. And Samuel. He glanced toward the window where small faces were pressed against the glass. Samuel needs a father to teach him how to be a good man. Kate felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Daniel, I haven't been courted. I haven't had time to think about love or marriage or... Then don't think, he said gently. Just tell me what your heart says. Kate looked into his gray eyes and saw her future. Not just survival, but happiness. Not just protection, but partnership. Not just acceptance, but love. My heart says yes, she whispered. Daniel's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that was gentle but full of promise. From the window came muffled cheering and Lucy's voice saying, I told you he should ask her. When they broke apart, Kate was laughing and crying at the same time. What happens now? Now, Daniel said. We tell the whole town that the sheriff and Mrs. Morrison are getting married. And anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me. But as they stood there in the lamplight, holding each other and planning their future, neither of them could have predicted the storm that was about to break over Silver Ridge, or the dangerous lengths to which some people would go to stop their happiness. Word of the engagement spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. By noon the next day, everyone in town knew that Sheriff Mackenzie and the widow Morrison were planning to marry, and opinions were sharply divided. At Henderson's General Store, the conversation was heated. It's a scandal, Mrs. Hartwell declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the shop. A man in his position, taking on 3 children that aren't even his own blood. Maybe he sees something in those children that the rest of us missed, suggested Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had always been kind to Kate. What he sees is a pretty face and a soft heart, Mrs. Henderson replied sourly. Mark my words, within a year he'll regret this decision. Meanwhile, at the Silver Dollar Saloon, the men's discussion was taking a darker turn. This changes everything, Mayor Whitman said grimly, nursing his whiskey. Mackenzie was already too independent for my liking. Now he'll be even more difficult to control. Control. Bill Crawford looked puzzled. Since when do we control the sheriff? Every elected official needs guidance from the community leaders, Whitman replied smoothly. Mackenzie has always been resistant to suggestions. Harold Peterson, who had been drinking steadily since the previous evening, slammed his glass down on the bar. This is intolerable. The man has made a mockery of proper courtship, proper procedure. Sounds like sour grapes to me, old Tom Brennan interrupted. Woman chose the better man, Peterson. Deal with it. Better man. Peterson's voice rose dangerously. Mackenzie may wear a badge, but that doesn't make him better than anyone else in this town. Actually, Pete from the livery stable said quietly, I think it kinda does. At least when it comes to character. The tension in the saloon was growing thick when the doors swung open and Sheriff Mackenzie himself entered. The conversation died instantly. Afternoon, gentlemen, Mackenzie said calmly, but his eyes were alert, taking in the hostile atmosphere. Sheriff, Mayor Whitman said with forced joviality, congratulations on your engagement. Quite a surprise. Thank you. Mackenzie's tone was neutral, but everyone could sense the warning beneath it. When's the wedding? Crawford asked, more out of genuine curiosity than malice. Saturday. Father Miguel will perform the ceremony at the church. This Saturday. Mrs. Hartwell, who had entered the saloon in pursuit of her husband, looked shocked. But that's only 5 days away. Surely you need more time to plan. We need time to be a family, Mackenzie replied simply. We've waited long enough. Peterson stood up abruptly, swaying slightly from the whiskey. Sheriff, I think you're making a mistake. That woman. Choose your next words very carefully, Peterson, Mackenzie warned, his voice deadly quiet. She's been leading me on for months, making me think she was interested in my proposal. Then she throws herself at the first man with a badge who shows her attention. The sound of Mackenzie's fist connecting with Peterson's jaw echoed through the saloon like a gunshot. Peterson crumpled to the floor, blood streaming from his nose. I warned you, Mackenzie said calmly, shaking out his knuckles. Mrs. Morrison is a lady, and you'll speak of her as such, or you'll answer to me. You can't just assault people. Mayor Whitman protested. There are laws. Yes, there are. Laws against slander, for instance. Laws against harassment. Mackenzie's gray eyes were hard as flint. Peterson has been bothering Mrs. Morrison for months, refusing to accept her rejection of his advances. That constitutes harassment in my book. He looked around the saloon, meeting each man's eyes. Anyone else care to share their opinions about my fiancé? The silence was deafening. Good. Then I suggest you all find something more productive to do with your time. As Mackenzie turned to leave, Mayor Whitman called after him. Sheriff, this kind of behavior is exactly what we're concerned about. Marriage to that woman is already affecting your judgment. Mackenzie stopped and turned back slowly. My judgment, Mayor Whitman? You just assaulted a citizen for expressing an opinion. I defended my fiancé's honor against a man who's been stalking her for months. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the territorial government. Maybe we will, Whitman replied, his voice carrying a threat. Mackenzie stepped closer to the mayor, and his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the saloon. Mayor, if you try to use my marriage as an excuse to challenge my authority, you'll discover just how much support I have in this community. The miners, the ranchers, the honest working people, they know I keep them safe. They know I'm fair. And they know the difference between a good man and a politician." With that he walked out, leaving behind a room full of angry, confused men and one unconscious bank clerk. Outside, Mackenzie was surprised to find Kate waiting for him, her face pale but determined. "I heard the shouting," she said quietly. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Peterson won't be bothering you anymore." Kate looked troubled. "Daniel, I don't want our marriage to cause problems for you. If the town leaders are against it." "Kate." He took her hands in his. "Look at me. I don't care what Whitman or Peterson or anyone else thinks. You and the children are my priority now. Everything else is just noise." But as they walked back toward her cabin together, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows, or the hate-filled eyes that followed their every move. The storm was just beginning. 3 days before the wedding, Kate was hanging laundry behind her cabin when she heard a horse approaching. She looked up to see Harold Peterson riding toward her, his face still bearing the bruises from his encounter with Sheriff Mackenzie. Kate's heart began racing. She was alone, the children were at school, and Daniel was out on patrol. Peterson's eyes held a wildness that made her deeply uneasy. "Mr. Peterson," she said carefully, not moving away from the clothesline. "What brings you here?" Peterson dismounted, moving with the careful precision of someone who was drunk but trying not to show it. "I came to talk sense into you, Catherine, before you make the biggest mistake of your life. I don't think we have anything to discuss. Don't we?" Peterson stepped closer, and Kate could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You could have had security, respectability, a proper home for your children. Instead, you're throwing yourself away on a man who'll get tired of playing daddy to another man's brats." "You need to leave," Kate said firmly, edging toward the cabin. "Now. I'm not finished." Peterson grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You think Mackenzie really loves you? He feels sorry for you, Catherine. That's all this is. Pity for the poor widow woman with too many mouths to feed. Let go of me. You could still change your mind. Call off this farce of a wedding. Marry me instead, and I'll provide for you and the children. Not because I pity you, but because I want you." The way he said "want" made Kate's skin crawl. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Mr. Peterson, you're hurting me. Please let go. Not until you listen to what I have to say." His free hand reached up to touch her face, and Kate recoiled. "You're a beautiful woman, Catherine. Beautiful and alone and making terrible choices." "The only terrible choice would be trusting a man who won't take no for an answer," Kate said, her voice steady despite her fear. Peterson's expression darkened. "You think you're too good for me? You, with your bastard children and your charity case life." "My children are not bastards," Kate said coldly. "And my life is my own to live. Not for much longer." Peterson's grip shifted to her shoulders, shaking her slightly. "Mackenzie won't want you once he realizes what a burden you really are. And when he throws you out, where will you go then? Who will want you?" "I will." The quiet voice came from behind Peterson, who spun around to find Sheriff Mackenzie standing 20 feet away. The lawman's hand rested casually on his gun, but there was nothing casual about the look in his eyes. "Sheriff," Peterson said, trying to sound confident despite being caught in a compromising position. "I was just having a conversation with Mrs. Morrison." "Conversation?" Mackenzie's voice was deceptively calm as he took in Kate's frightened expression and the finger marks on her wrists. "Is that what you call grabbing a woman against her will?" "I wasn't." "Kate," Mackenzie said without taking his eyes off Peterson, "go inside. Lock the door. Daniel. Go inside. Now." Kate hurried toward the cabin, pausing only when she reached the door. She wanted to go inside as Daniel had ordered, but something in his stance worried her. He looked like a man on the edge of violence. "Peterson," Mackenzie said once Kate was safely inside, "you have 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride away." "You can't threaten me. I'm a respected citizen of this town. You're a drunk who just assaulted my fiancée. That makes you a criminal. Peterson's face flushed red. Assaulted? I barely touched her. I saw the marks on her wrists. I heard her tell you to let go. That's assault in any court of law. It's your word against mine. Mackenzie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, it's not. Kate's word carries a lot of weight with me, and you just gave me all the evidence I need to arrest you. On what charges? Assault, harassment, public drunkenness, disturbing the peace. Should I go on? Peterson looked around desperately, as if seeking help that wouldn't come. This is because of her, isn't it? You're so besotted with that woman that you can't see straight. She's bewitched you, Mackenzie. Made you forget your duty to this community. My duty is to protect good people from bad ones. You're making that very easy for me. You think you've won, don't you? Peterson's voice took on an ugly tone. You think marrying her will solve all your problems. But you don't know what I know. Something in Peterson's tone made Mackenzie pause. What are you talking about? Ask your precious Catherine about her first husband's death. Ask her what really happened to James Morrison. Mackenzie's expression didn't change, but Kate, watching from the window, saw his hand move closer to his gun. Explain yourself, Peterson. James Morrison didn't die of cholera, Sheriff. He died of poison. And his loving wife was the only one with him when it happened. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Mackenzie was very still for a long moment, then stepped closer to Peterson. That's a serious accusation, Peterson. I hope you have proof to back it up. I have questions that have never been answered. Why was Catherine the only one who didn't get sick when cholera swept through their house? Why was she so quick to refuse an autopsy? Why did she burn all of her husband's belongings? Maybe because she was grieving and trying to protect her children from further trauma. Or maybe because she was hiding evidence. Peterson mounted his horse, suddenly confident again. Ask her, Mackenzie. Ask her about the insurance money. Ask her why she left Boston so quickly. Ask her why she was so eager to marry a stranger and start over where nobody knew her history. As Peterson rode away, his words echoed in the afternoon air. Mackenzie stood motionless for several minutes, then walked slowly toward the cabin. Kate was waiting on the porch, her face pale but determined. I heard what he said, she said quietly. And Kate looked into the gray eyes of the man she was supposed to marry in 3 days, searching for any sign of doubt or suspicion. What she saw instead was patience and trust, and it nearly broke her heart. And I think, she said softly, it's time I told you the truth about my first husband's death. Kate led Daniel inside the cabin and poured 2 cups of coffee with hands that trembled only slightly. She had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when she would have to trust someone with the truth about James's death. She had just hoped it would be her choice of when and how to reveal it. Sit down, Daniel, she said quietly. Please. Mackenzie settled into one of the simple wooden chairs, his gray eyes never leaving her face. Kate, whatever happened in Boston, it doesn't change how I feel about you. It might, she said, sitting across from him. Because Harold Peterson wasn't entirely wrong. Daniel's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands still on the table. James didn't die of cholera, Kate continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. He died of pneumonia, but not the kind that comes from disease. She took a shaky breath and continued. Peterson was right about one thing. I was the only one who didn't get sick when cholera came through our neighborhood. But it wasn't because I poisoned anyone. It was because I spent 3 weeks caring for everyone else, including James, and somehow I just didn't catch it. Go on, Daniel said gently. James was getting better. The doctor said he was past the worst of it. But then, one night, he started having trouble breathing. The doctor said his lungs were damaged from the cholera, that fluid was building up. Kate's voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to continue. He was drowning, Daniel. Drowning in his own body, and there was nothing anyone could do to save him. He begged me. He begged me not to let him suffer. Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes, but he said nothing, waiting for her to finish. I gave him laudanum, Kate whispered. More than the doctor prescribed. Enough to ease his breathing, to help him sleep. I told myself I was just making him comfortable, but you knew it might be enough to stop his breathing altogether, Daniel finished gently. Kate nodded, tears flowing freely now. He died peacefully, in his sleep, holding my hand. And I've wondered every day since then if I murdered my husband or mercifully ended his suffering. Is that why you refused an autopsy? Partly. But also because I couldn't bear the thought of them cutting into him, taking him apart to satisfy their curiosity. He'd suffered enough. Daniel reached across the table and took her hands in his. Kate, look at me. She raised her tear-stained face to meet his eyes. You didn't murder anyone, he said firmly. You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. Any woman who loved her husband would have done the same thing. But Peterson is right about the insurance money, Kate said miserably. James had a policy, and when he died, it paid out enough for me to live on for a while. Some people in Boston thought it was suspicious, a young wife, a dead husband, and insurance money. Is that why you left? That, and the whispers. The looks. The way people treated my children like they were tainted somehow. Kate wiped her eyes with her sleeve. I wanted a fresh start for them, somewhere nobody knew our story. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. Finally, he spoke. Kate, I have a question for you, and I want you to answer honestly. All right. Do you regret what you did? Do you regret easing James's suffering, even knowing what it might mean? Kate thought about it, really thought about it, for the first time in 2 years. No, she said finally. I regret that he had to suffer at all. I regret that I had to make that choice. But I don't regret sparing him pain when there was no hope left. Then neither do I. Daniel squeezed her hands. Kate, what you did was an act of love and mercy. It doesn't make you a murderer. It makes you a woman who loved her husband enough to sacrifice her own peace of mind for his comfort. But what if people find out? What if Peterson spreads this story around town? Let him try. Daniel's voice hardened. Peterson is a bitter drunk who's angry because you chose me over him. Even if people believe his story, what does it matter? You're not the same woman you were in Boston, and this isn't the same situation. Isn't it? I'm asking you to take on a widow with 3 children and a questionable past. Maybe Peterson is right, maybe you're making a mistake. Daniel stood up and pulled Kate to her feet, holding her close. Kate Morrison, you listen to me. I don't care what happened in Boston. I don't care what people think about your past. I care about the woman who mends clothes to pay for her children's schooling. I care about the mother who reads bedtime stories even when she's exhausted. I care about the lady who treats everyone with kindness even when they don't deserve it. He pulled back to look into her eyes. That's the woman I'm marrying on Saturday. Everything else is just history. Kate felt a weight she'd been carrying for 2 years finally lift from her shoulders. Are you sure? Because once we're married, my past becomes your responsibility too. Our past, Daniel corrected. And our future. Kate, I'm not James. I'm not asking you to choose between my comfort and your conscience. I'm asking you to build a new life with me, one where you don't have to carry burdens alone anymore. As they held each other in the simple cabin, both knew that Peterson's threats were far from over. But for the first time since James's death, Kate felt like she might actually have a chance at happiness. The wedding was still 3 days away, but the hardest conversation was behind them. Or so they thought. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp October air that made everything seem possible. Kate woke early and lay in bed for a moment, listening to her children's quiet breathing and trying to believe that this day was really happening. In a few hours, she would become Mrs. Daniel Mackenzie. Her children would have a father. And for the first time in 2 years, she would have a partner to share her burdens and her joys. "Mama." Lucy's sleepy voice came from the next bed. "Is today the day you marry Sheriff Mackenzie?" "Yes, sweetheart. Today's the day." "Good," Lucy said firmly. "I like him. And I think Papa would like him too." The simple statement brought tears to Kate's eyes. Lucy rarely mentioned her father, but when she did, it was always with the uncomplicated wisdom of a child who understood love better than most adults. "I think Papa would like him too," Kate agreed softly. The morning passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Crawford, two of the few women in town who had supported the engagement, arrived early to help Kate with her hair and dress. Even Dr. Hayes's wife had come, bringing wildflowers from her garden for Kate's bouquet. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Patterson said as she put the finishing touches on Kate's hair. "Absolutely radiant." Kate looked at herself in the small mirror and was surprised by what she saw. The woman looking back at her was confident, hopeful, and genuinely happy. Her dress, her best blue silk that she'd worn to marry James, had been altered slightly to fit her better, and the wildflower bouquet added a touch of color that made her eyes sparkle. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "All of you. I never expected such kindness." "Nonsense," Mrs. Crawford said briskly. "Sheriff Mackenzie is getting a wonderful wife, and you deserve all the happiness in the world." Meanwhile, at the jail, Daniel was receiving his own assistance from an unlikely source. Tom Brennan had arrived with a clean shirt and a bottle of bay rum, while Pete from the livery stable had brought Daniel's freshly brushed coat. "Never thought I'd see the day when our sheriff got himself hitched," Tom wheezed, helping Daniel with his collar. "But I'll tell you what. You picked yourself a fine woman." "I know," Daniel said simply, and something in his tone made both men look at him with respect. "You nervous?" Pete asked. "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "Not about marrying Kate. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. But about being a good father to those children. They've been through enough disappointment." "Sheriff," Tom said seriously, "I've seen you handle drunken miners, cattle rustlers, and claim jumpers without breaking a sweat. I think you can manage 3 kids who already think you hung the moon." As the church bells began to ring, calling the town to witness the ceremony, Daniel straightened his shoulders and prepared to become not just a husband, but a father. The small church was packed beyond capacity. Word of the wedding had spread to the surrounding ranches and mining camps, and it seemed like half the territory had come to see the sheriff marry the widow Morrison. Some came out of genuine good wishes, others out of curiosity, and a few, like Peterson and Mayor Whitman, came hoping to witness a disaster. Kate walked down the aisle on the arm of Dr. Hayes, who had graciously offered to give her away. Behind her came her 3 children, Tommy looking solemn and proud in his best clothes, Lucy scattering flower petals with 8-year-old enthusiasm, and little Samuel clutching a small ring pillow with both hands. But it was Daniel's reaction that made the entire church hold its breath. When Kate appeared at the back of the church, the tough lawman's face lit up with such pure joy that even the cynics in the congregation felt their hearts soften. As she walked toward him, Kate saw nothing but Daniel, tall, strong, and looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. All the whispers, all the doubts, all the fears faded away. This was right. This was meant to be. Father Miguel began the ceremony with words about love, commitment, and the blessing of joining 2 families into one. When it came time for the vows, Daniel spoke first, his deep voice carrying clearly through the church. "Catherine, I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be a faithful husband and a loving father to Tommy, Lucy, and Samuel. I promise that your joys will be my joys, your sorrows will be my sorrows, and your children will be our children." Kate's voice shook only slightly as she repeated her own vows, promising to love, honor, and stand beside Daniel through whatever challenges life might bring. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was gentle but full of promise. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, The church erupted in applause. But the loudest cheers came from 3 small voices in the front row: Tommy, Lucy, and Samuel, celebrating the fact that they finally had a complete family again. As the newlyweds walked back down the aisle together, followed by their children, even the skeptics had to admit that they looked like they belonged together. Daniel's hand was gentle on Kate's back, while his other hand rested on Tommy's shoulder. Lucy skipped beside them, and Samuel had somehow ended up in Daniel's arms, chattering excitedly about the party. The reception was held in the church hall, with food contributed by half the town. As Kate watched Daniel teaching Tommy how to carve the ham, as she saw Lucy showing off her flower crown to anyone who would listen, as she felt little Samuel fall asleep in her lap after too much cake and excitement, she realized that this was what happiness felt like. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't afraid of the future. But as the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, neither Kate nor Daniel noticed the dark look on Harold Peterson's face, or the way he left the reception early with Mayor Whitman and 2 other men. The celebration was over, but the real challenges were just beginning. 6 months later, spring had come to Silver Ridge, and with it, a transformation that nobody could have predicted. The Mackenzie family had not only survived the transition from courthouse wedding to daily life, they had thrived. Kate stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Daniel teach Tommy how to handle a rifle safely. At 13, Tommy had grown several inches and developed the confident bearing of a young man who knew he was valued and loved. His relationship with Daniel had evolved from cautious respect to genuine affection, and Kate often caught them having the kind of father-son conversations that Tommy had been missing since James died. "Mama, look," Lucy called from the garden where she was helping plant vegetables. At 9, she had developed a love of growing things and spent hours talking to the plants as if they were personal friends. "The tomatoes are getting flowers." Little Samuel, now 4, was napping in the shade of the oak tree, exhausted from a morning of helping Daniel fix the fence. He had taken to calling Daniel Papa Dan, without any prompting, and Daniel's face still lit up every time he heard it. The changes in the family were obvious, but the changes in the town were more subtle and perhaps more important. Kate had indeed become indispensable to the community, just as she had planned. She taught school 3 days a week, helped Dr. Hayes with medical emergencies, and had organized everything from harvest festivals to church fundraisers. More importantly, she had changed how people thought about families. When the Hendersons took in their orphaned nephew, nobody questioned whether they were equipped to handle another mouth to feed. When Mrs. Patterson's sister arrived with her 4 children after her husband died in a mine accident, the town rallied to help instead of suggesting the orphanage. "Mrs. Mackenzie?" The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, a young Chinese woman whose husband worked for the railroad. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my little boy has a fever, and Dr. Hayes is out at the Morrison Ranch." Kate immediately set aside her mending. "Of course, Sarah. Let me get my medical bag." This was another change. Kate had become the town's unofficial nurse, working alongside Dr. Hayes to care for people who couldn't afford full medical treatment. She had a gift for calming frightened children and worried mothers, and her gentle touch was often as healing as any medicine. As she prepared to leave, Daniel appeared with Tommy and Samuel in tow. "Emergency?" he asked, reading her expression. "Sarah's little boy has a fever. I'll be back by dinner." "I'll ride with you," Daniel said. "Tommy, you and Samuel help your mama finish the garden." This too had become routine, Daniel escorting Kate on her medical calls, not because he doubted her abilities, but because he knew how precious she was and wanted to make sure she was safe. As they rode toward the Chinese section of town, Kate reflected on how much their lives had changed. The gossips had largely given up trying to find fault with their marriage. Peterson had left town 3 months ago after making one too many drunken accusations about Kate's past, and Mayor Whitman had learned to work with Daniel rather than against him. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel said as they rode. "Just thinking about how different everything is now," Kate replied. 6 months ago, I was the town burden. Now I feel like I actually belong here." "You always belonged here. People just needed time to see what I saw from the beginning." Kate smiled at her husband's unwavering confidence. "And what was that?" "That you're the strongest, kindest, most capable woman in the territory, and that any community would be lucky to have you. They reached the Chen house to find little Michael burning with fever, but responsive. Kate quickly diagnosed a case of the flu that was going around and left Sarah with instructions for care and a promise to check on them the next day. As they rode back home, they could see their children playing in the yard, Tommy teaching Lucy how to whittle while Samuel supervised from his perch on the fence. "Happy?" Daniel asked, watching Kate's face as she took in the scene. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "Good. Because I have something to tell you." Something in his tone made Kate look at him sharply. "What?" Daniel's face broke into a grin. "Dr. Hayes thinks you might be expecting." Kate felt the world tilt beneath her saddle. "What? How could he? When did you?" "I asked him to check on you last week when you were feeling poorly. He said it's still early, but all the signs are there." Kate's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. A baby. Another child to love, to worry about, to cherish. A child who would know Daniel as their father from the very beginning. "Are you happy about it?" she asked anxiously. Daniel stopped his horse and leaned over to kiss her gently. "Kate Mackenzie, I've never been happier about anything in my life. Another child, our child, to add to our family." As they resumed their ride home, Kate felt the familiar flutter of new life beginning inside her. But this time, she wasn't facing pregnancy alone or in grief. This time, she had a partner who would share every moment of joy and worry. When they reached the cabin, Daniel lifted her down from her horse and held her close for a moment. "Ready to tell the children?" he asked. "Ready for anything, as long as you're with me," Kate replied. And as they walked toward their home together, followed by the sound of their children's laughter, Kate realized that sometimes the best endings were really just new beginnings in disguise. The widow who had been mocked for her burdens had become the woman who was treasured for her blessings. And the sheriff who had been feared for his strength had become the man who was loved for his gentleness. In the end, love had indeed conquered all, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the quiet, daily choice to see the best in each other and to build something beautiful together. The gossips had been wrong about many things, but they had been right about one. The marriage between Sheriff Mackenzie and Kate Morrison had indeed changed everything in Silver Ridge. For the better.